All right, welcome to the Groundswell Identity Panel. So for more than 100 years, publishers have been dependent on advertising to fund the development of premium content. And the internet obviously is no exception. Relevant advertising pays for a lot of the content we've all come to enjoy, whether that's mobile apps, streaming TV, all the web experiences. That value exchange is not usually well understood or communicated. And I think it's that lack of clarity in communication that's created so much angst with consumers, regulators, and as a result, big tech. So as our industry moves from old and weird approaches to identity, like cookies, to things that are more modern and sustainable, I think there's an opportunity to create a new approach. One that explains the value exchange to consumers while providing them more transparency and control, which we've been trying to do for years with cookies, but cookies have just made it so hard. One which allows publishers to optimize the value of their content, and one that enables advertisers to improve advertising experiences while protecting consumer privacy. There doesn't have to be any tension there if we do this right. But such an approach requires innovative thinking, industry-wide collaboration, and so we've pulled together a number of experts from across media and marketing to discuss the future of addressable digital advertising. So let me introduce the panel real quick. So we've got Andrew Casale, President and CEO of Index Exchange, Amanda Martin, the VP of Enterprise Partnerships at Goodway Group, Chris Guenther, SVP and Global Head of Programmatic at News Corp, and Michelle Hulst, EVP of Global Data and Strategy at the Trade Desk. We'll also be asking for a little bit of audience participation. It's weird, it's COVID, we're over Zoom, but we're gonna throw up some survey questions to start getting your feedback. And of course, we always value all the feedback that we can get and all the questions. We'll make sure that we get those all answered. So let's dive in. Let's start with where are we and how did we get here? So Amanda, as an industry, do you think we've done a good or a bad job of explaining the value exchange of the internet?
I think we've done a poor job. I actually don't think we've explained it. And because of that, we find ourselves in a situation where consumers are confused and overwhelmed by the potential use of their data, and therefore they don't value the exchange. And so if we can solve that misconception, I think we can lead to a better solution and more opportunity for the industry as a whole.
And how do you think that's impacted the current landscape? Like what are the consequences of that in the actions of Apple and Google and the others?
Well, I started my career at a publisher and working for a newspaper. And I think what you see is that journalism has taken the biggest hit by that lack of understanding of that value exchange, by users not understanding that the ads that they see pay for the content and the validated sources that they rely on for news and information and fun content that they want to consume. They have seen that depreciate, and it hasn't been as great and as valuable as it has been in the past. And so because of that, we're seeing a world where a lot of people are relying on Facebook and Google to tell them everything they need to know. And that's a dangerous equation.
What do you think, Michelle?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think it's been a poor consumer experience to date, and I think we really need to do a better job of explaining the value exchange of the internet to consumers. Basically, hey, if you want to access content for free, there is a value exchange that you need to engage in order to do that. I don't think it's clear at all to people right now.
Well, yeah, and you see a lot of people installing ad blockers or things like that. They're not having an honest conversation with themselves about any value exchange. They're just trying to fix a user experience that they don't like. You know, it's a very one-sided topic. That's all I think led us to this place where Google is threatening to take away the third-party cookie as if that's the problem. But Andrew, what do you think? Are they actually going to do it this time? Are they going to take away the cookie?
I'm in the camp that I do think they're serious, and I do think the cookie is going away. Remains to be seen if the iOS precedent perhaps creates a dynamic where maybe there is a prolonged end of life instead of the sort of pre-announced 2-year time frame. But I think these are all connected problems, right? To the consumer, where there is so much fragmentation and control. How do I control my data? and how do I control my preferences when they span across vendor, domain, device. It creates this perception that there must be something going on that's, maybe really bad. Maybe there's a lot of my data out there. Maybe they know everything about me. And the truth is often a lot less interesting than that. It's often signals that help drive better outcomes for marketers, and a better ad experience for me as the consumer. But this opaque cloak has created this dynamic where the mind just kind of runs off, and I think it's creating pressure from these platforms, whether they be Apple or Google or whomever, to respond to the consumer concern. And I really just think it is grounded or underpinned in this lack of transparency and control that's persisted for far too long.
So in terms of our industry's response to this, do you think it matters if they take away the cookie? Or should we wait, or should we just do something now?
We really,
go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, we really need to do something now and not wait, because we also have a lot of precedent for what happens when the industry waits too long. Take GDPR. We knew it was coming years in advance, months in advance, days in advance, and a lot of companies waited to act right at that point in time. And as a result, there was far too much of a long tail to get everything in place, and it's created its own version of confusion. This is not one to prolong. This is one to lean into and to get right and get done early. That'd be my reco.
I totally agree. That's why I've been talking so much about what's good about this. And there's a lot of cool things that we can create if we just get a little more creative than relying on whatever the browsers let us do in the first place. So in terms of the opportunity to create something better, let's all talk about what are the priorities that we need to focus on. What would be success? Why don't we start with Chris?
I mean, I think clearly this has to be consumer centric. I mean, I think there's been a lot of good points made about, it's not been very clear to the user what's going on with their data, which I think gives rise to sort of urban legends like, Facebook is listening to you and then recording every word you say and sending ads. I think those kind of things exist when there is a lack of understanding. So I think we have to make it user first. I think there has to be accountability and auditability of what we do with identity. And, and if we combine that, give the controls, I think those are sort of the base things that we need to do as we look forward to sort of the next phase of an identity solution.
Amanda, what are you thinking about?
I think it has to be open source. I think it has to be available to everyone, and there can't be a barrier of cost in order to participate, in order for the open internet to truly stay open. The goal is not to recreate a walled garden of the internet as we see it. And that's different from a paywall or a free wall. That's about truly having access to the content you need to have so that you can get the information you rely on. I also think that it's important for us to not follow the leader like we have in so many of these instances. As an industry, we often wait to hear what Google is going to do or what Facebook is going to do or now what Apple is going to do. And for us to truly kind of gain control of our own destiny per se, we need to act outside of their actions. So even if Google never takes the third-party cookie away, we need a better solution than the third-party cookie no matter what.
I think that's a great point, that for the entire life of the internet, there's been a free and ubiquitous way to do some kind of user identification in the cookie, and having some sort of, commercial entity that's responsible for doling out that right isn't something I think any of us can accept. What about you, Michelle? What do you think we should focus on?
Yeah, I think also all of the points that were already made, and I think it needs to be something that's just really lightweight and scalable. We can't overcomplicate it, because if we overcomplicate it, we're never going to get there, right? So we just need to make it really simple, straightforward. Like Amanda was saying, I think open source is really key. And then on the consumer side, I think we need to think just always as folks that are helping design the experience of the internet. What would I want to experience as a consumer? That we should use that as a guidepost to what we do.
Absolutely. What about you, Andrew?
Simple and easy is key. It can't be overly complicated. It has to be easy for anyone to understand or for anyone to explain. It has to be easy for a consumer to understand, to control. And I think, great point made as well. about the lack of kind of any overly corporate overlord over this whole thing. The internet's open, the open web's open, and what solves this problem should be as well. Otherwise, you're just asking for all kinds of new problems, which I think in some respects could be worse than the cookie. But yeah, simple and easy. Don't overcomplicate it.
Cool. So let's talk about like what's at stake. So let's start with the buy side. So Amanda, your business is obviously reliant on targeting, on attribution. What would it mean if that all came under pressure? And then also generally, how are you thinking about preserving privacy and all the proposals out there for preserving privacy while retaining relevance?
The way we look at it is our buyers are also, if not publishers, because they're having a consumer facing relationship. So they have to respect the privacy, just like the publishers that we place ads on their sites on their behalf. For us though, it's really about understanding the ability to execute in a way that is improved from what we have today, but still facilitates the return on ad spend that our advertisers are looking to us for. Performance is key. And so for us, as much as targeting is important, it's really about measurement and attribution that's driving more of our advertisers' concern. And it's about how do they justify the spend that they put out there in the market. So I think a lot of focus has been about being able to actually execute advertising in the sense of targeting. But I think the piece that we're focusing on is more the measurement and attribution so that we can show the value of the open internet versus, say, a walled garden experience.
Yeah, so what about you, Chris? What's at stake on the publisher side from your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's about our credibility and our voice that's at stake. I mean, when I talk about credibility, I think it's about our relationship with our users. You know, they're making the choice to come to our sites. They're making the choice to download our apps and, you know, and making choice to register for our newsletters. And, you know, they're coming to us, like we are their, you know, their destination. But they're doing that by doing that, they're placing their trust in us. And we have to make sure that we are being as transparent in terms of how we're using their information, you know, how we're leveraging it for monetization, how we're leveraging it for site experience. So they should have the confidence that we're going to do that in a way that is appropriate, not creepy. I think that's always a good guideline. It's like try not to be make it feel like users are having a creepy ad experience. And you know, you could say that right now, some ways the industry operating, we couldn't even pass that threshold. And in terms of our voice, I think it's you know, I think publishers just need to speak up and be more active. And I think that's changing. But, you know, you think about it, the IB was founded by publishers. But yet most people probably wouldn't even think about the, you know, publishers are now like a secondary or tertiary member of the IB. And I think that's largely, you know, to be self-reflective. I think it's our own fault as publishers that we haven't stood up. We haven't put the right people within the technical side in the working groups or be involved. And, you know, like I said, I think that's changing. I think there's a much more activist presence in the IB Tech Lab. I think organizations like prebid.org, where publishers are getting more active, it's going to be critical for us to maintain that voice and grow that voice as publishers.
Yeah, so we've touched a bit on user experience. I'm curious if you want to dive deeper, like Andrew, I don't know if you've thought about like how the user experience ties together across all of this and all the various places that we're having little conversations with consumers about privacy. What can we do to clean it up?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's helpful just to think about the problem right now for a second. So if you think of user experience from the consumer's perspective today, you know, the classic narrative in response to, you know, painting the portrait that Chris put forth of the creepy factor is, you know, the shoes that won't stop following me all over the place. And so if I'm a consumer, you know, I'm seeing them on my laptop and maybe I'm hitting the ad choices icon and opting out. Then I'm seeing them on my phone. I'm seeing them in my Facebook feed. Maybe now I'm seeing them on my connected television. And all of those platforms have disparate control mechanisms, opt-out mechanisms. So if I'm a consumer that wants to fully take control over my experience, it's really hard and really complicated. And so, you know, if you think of the underlying problem here, it isn't even just that the problem is misunderstood by the consumer. It's legitimately a problem. This is far too difficult. And so, when you think forward about solutions that unify, some of these problems, the idea of me having a unified identifier that will bind me cross-device, that will work everywhere, that will give me one place to extract transparency or to implement control, it is just so much better. It's less to think about, it's less cognitive load, it's easier, it's simple. And so it's going to take quite a pivot to make the tomorrow version of events real, certainly, but you can also immediately realize those benefits, which is why I strongly believe it is going to work. And I also believe that it is going to compel the walled gardens to have to respond somehow. Just as the example I cited, these problems are not just issues today of the open web. Oftentimes, if I want to control my experience, even within Facebook, that's a different set of preferences. So I think that's going to also start to expose some of those flaws too. The walled gardens will also need to do something to fix this consumer problem once and for all.
Yeah, and that's really, that line of thinking is what led us to Project Rearc in the first place, and why we all have jumped to saying an email address is going to be the thing that ties it all together. Because what we're looking for is something that is, fairly isolated, or isolated enough from your actual identity. So we're not going to do, social security numbers or anything crazy like that. You can create a separate email account to manage your preferences if you want to, but we need some central place to hang those preferences. And that allows us all to work together to actually do a better job of honoring preferences. So it's funny that we've started this project to make it so that, we can do a better job of targeting and doing attribution by saying, well, how do I just make sure that I'm doing the right thing and doing what the consumer asked me to do, and having a place to hold that. So Michelle, what do you think in terms of measurement in the new world? I mean, it's already a complicated world out there on the internet. I don't know if this is making it more complicated or more simple, or just how do you think in particular marketers should be thinking about measurement?
Sure. So one is, I think marketers should be thinking about, we need to support a solution to continue measurement. To Amanda's point before, that's definitely something that's of interest to them. And a solution like this would allow that to occur, right? So if you think about right now, a lot of measurement is driven off of cookies. If cookies go away, we don't have that solution anymore to use. This will allow that to continue. The key is that it will be dependent upon logged in users, right? So that's an important piece. So the scale piece is important. But then you have this massive, think of it as a panel, but a massive panel now, much bigger than any other panel that we've known in the past, that we can use for measurement, which is, I mean, it's really exciting. And I think also, as we think about data providers and how data flows, and providing data-driven advertising and measurement solutions across the web, this will enable both of those. So,
Amanda, how are you thinking about it? And we were talking earlier about how you can't perfectly identify every person on the internet now, and yet you're managing large-scale campaigns that are trying to influence as many people as you possibly can. How does this change that, if at all?
I think one, it continues things that we are now currently able to do, but more importantly, like, we acknowledge that it's not this silver bullet that fixes everything, and it doesn't allow us to do everything that we can do with the third-party cookie. But I think, to a point we talked about earlier, like, not all our budget is retargeting, and so therefore we can utilize this to talk to our most important and known clients and consumers. But we also can use it to learn about who to go and prospect, but serve a good advertising experience too. And so I think the thought process of it being, probably the largest panel that we've seen, lets us inform and go across the entire ecosystem, as opposed to thinking about it just in like the closed off, logged in experience. And I think that's kind of taking that vantage point and expanding it past just, okay, when it's logged in and it's this perfect one-to-one solution, but it also has the ability to, to be modeled out. And so I think that's probably the most interesting thing for us, is that I think it's like the linchpin and the key for us to move forward, moving away from the cookie.
I was just going to jump in real quick too, because I think you bring up a good point. Like, a lot of times when we start down this path, I think we go to utopia right away, right? Like, this is amazing. Okay, we're going to do everything. Like, this is going to solve everything. And if we go back to the principle that we talked about earlier, which was keeping it simple, that's where you really have to strike that balance. And so I think everything that you just talked about, Amanda, is so true, right? Like, yes, everybody wants utopia, but let's be realistic about also the principle of keeping it simple. And then what all can we do kind of in between both of those guideposts? And that's really a lot of what we're talking about today.
I think that's a really good point as well, because it's a common counter narrative that, you know, the idea of sort of tomorrow's identity being connected to a login when you think of content today that largely is consumed without any friction. It's going to be quite a process before we get to a point where we will have ubiquity of identity across all these devices or all these environments, but everything starts somewhere. And it might start relatively small, and to Amanda's point, the requirements might also be relatively simple, but hopefully it will work and be effective, also be very clear to the consumer. And once we have something that is working and effective, scaling it out, I don't think will be quite as challenging because we have a lot of precedents for that as well, whether they be things like ads.txt, the OpenRTB protocol, or even more recently, GDPR or TCF2. The industry can rally around a solution set and standard quite quickly once it is proven to be effective. And I think that's a big part of this as well. It's not going to be an overnight thing where everyone's behavior changes. It's going to take time, and that's okay, and that's pretty normal.
I also think there is a lot of precedent, though. So especially if you think about channels outside of the web, if you think about CTV apps and apps generally, I think consumers are more used to logging in to those kinds of environments, and also, you know, more clear maybe on the value exchange than they are, you know, just sort of visiting some random websites. And so one thing to call out is that the email address solution works in all of those environments. And so it's finally a good way for us to tie everything together that can make a little more sense.
Yeah, and back to your point on measurement, if we can tie everything together, it's a much more effective solution for marketers, which is great. So.
Yeah, no, Dave, I think it's interesting that you mentioned about the login, because I think that's also where, yes, where everyone's sort of logged in across their, you know, Disney Plus or Netflix or whatever. And so I think it's good that we're establishing that behavior. But I also think it's an area where you could probably say we've also created, again, a poor user experience. Like, how often are you forgetting what your passwords are and things like that? I mean, it's a whole other problem to solve about a more broader single sign-on. But like, it's just, we keep kind of creating these user experiences and they're not really great for them.
Yeah, I personally think single sign-on has to be a part of the ultimate solution. It's not necessarily what you jump to first, but
Totally
like if you start thinking about a login, an internet where you have to log into every website, you're kind of like, oh no. But if we can make it, you know, work well, if we can provide those tools, then it's not a big deal. I think the pushback to that isn't so much from a privacy point of view, it's from a user experience point of view, and how you want to deal with the web. Like, personally, it drives me crazy the way my phone tries to force me to subscribe to large packages instead of just letting me see some ads. You know, we just need to level up the conversation there.
I also think if people realize that, I think you touched on it earlier, but we don't want to know, advertisers do not want to know everything about you. We're not interested in collecting treasure troves of information. We're interested about giving you a good ad experience. And so I think with the email, it's simple and it's easy, which I think is the baseline of any successful standard that has worked in this industry. But I think it also is something that consumers are used to providing. And they're just not used to providing the plethora of information that they maybe assume they're giving us, or that maybe bad actors have made them feel like they're giving us. And so I think that consumer narrative is probably the place we all need to start.
Yeah, and so one of the other big benefits of the email address is it makes it a lot easier to provide a transparency framework. So one thing we've been trying to build forever is a way for consumers to log in and find all the data we have about them, because, like Andrew said earlier, it's not that interesting. Like, there's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing to hide. And our industry's failure to do that has nothing to do with wanting to hide anything and everything to do with it being difficult. And, you know, particularly with the GDPR stuff, the standard, I think industry standard lawyer response is, you actually can't give someone who has a cookie all of the data about that cookie because you don't know if it's them. And so all these data access requests are getting handed, you know, a letter saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'd love to give you that information, but I can't prove that it's you, which you can solve with an email address. So, you know, back to that, like, if you were CTO of the internet, how would you design this thing? You would never start with a cookie, and just all the chaos that came with it. So, you know, that's what we're effectively trying to do now, is just how should all of this work in the future. So let's pivot to economics. So, you know, particularly, like, let's start with Chris and then Andrew from the publisher side. You know, there's other proposals out there, like Privacy Sandbox and various other things. Talk to me about how you're thinking about the economic impacts of the various paths of the choose your own adventure in front of you.
I mean, I think the, you know, being honest with ourselves, the economics of the internet right now for publishers were sucky even before the third-party cookies started being depreciated. I think this myth of the, you know, the infinite impressions, it didn't really matter as long as you're kind of applying third-party data. It doesn't matter whether the site you're reaching people on and, you know, and the lower CPMs. I think that's been hurting publishers for quite a while. You know, that's why one of the reasons I'm sort of optimistic about these changes. Yes, this is going to be a you know, very interesting transition period, but I do think that is it will put more sort of influence and essentially power in publishers' hands. A lot of these solutions are about you know, limiting the how you can transport data between sites. So it's about the power, you know, so the publisher is the one who brings to the table some of the insights about the user, about, you know, what they're doing on that site. So I think that's going to help the economics for the publisher. I think that, and obviously I think it has to make sense though. Like, you know, I think advertisers in the end are only going to pay if they get the kind of KPIs that they're looking for. But I think as we're bringing to the table the data, the insights into these individuals to the buy side, I think it'll be you'll see more positive trends, and it's also what context matters, right? It's not about, no longer the myth of the infinite impressions. Like, it's really going to matter where you're reaching this person and what you know about this person in a privacy compliant way.
What do you think about, Andrew?
Couldn't agree more with that. I would look at two dimensions on this question. The first dimension is we have some living examples that we can observe of what happens when we go from arguably debatably good addressability in the third-party cookie to no addressability, at least in the context of audience. And so you can kind of see those living examples through the browsers where, you know, we lost the third-party cookie in Safari first. About a year ago, we lost it in Firefox. We still have it in Chrome for now. And, you know, what's interesting about those examples is when addressability goes away, at least in the form of the third-party cookie, CPMs drop right at that moment, right with it. And with a few years now to observe Safari, and at least a year now to observe Firefox, the ad spend doesn't really come back. The CPMs don't recover. At least they haven't yet. And so we have that example that just, it's worthy of note, which tells us that some form of addressability, even non-optimal in the form of, you know, the third-party cookie with all of its faults, does help induce spend and does likely help drive marketer outcomes. We can debate whether or not the methodology makes sense, but we certainly have the proof in pudding in the form of what we see today in the market. And so I think it's worth pointing that out, because then you have to ask yourself, well, if that occurs, where's the money going? Because marketers are generally spending their marketing budgets somewhere, and they're generally growing those budgets and hopefully having successful companies that sell their products. And so when you look at another industry narrative, which is where does the growth in our industry typically go, increasingly where it was once 70% goes to a small number of the walled gardens, became 80%, became, I think it's around 90% now of that new growth is going to a small number of companies. We're kind of starting to see what happens when you lose signal, and when we see that crater, the money's still being spent, it's just now being spent somewhere else. And when you start to look into those environments, it becomes abundantly clear that they have had no signal loss at all. And they did not have the crutch of the cookie. They had arguably better addressability the entire time, because they're typically underpinned by these same concepts. And so that, to me, is where I'm pretty optimistic that what we're talking about isn't really just an industry preservation let's make the new cookie and hopefully hold on to the market that's not growing. But instead, let's fix the fundamental systemic problem that's been there the entire time, showcase and prove that we've really just had a lot of measurement issues and fidelity issues that have been harming the perception of the value of publisher media this entire time. Let's correct that imbalance, and maybe the entire market looks a whole lot better on the other side. But that's kind of how I would view, you know, this particular topic.
Yeah, we spent some time like doing math about like what would this all look like if there was turtle dove and flock and, you know, the things that Chrome has been proposing. And I stopped doing those pretty quickly because the answer one was not good. Like, you know, particularly for long tail publishers and advertisers, particularly for the noble cause that Amanda and I have to help brands find new customers. Those technologies don't work for that. And so it just seems obvious to me that we're going to pivot to something else. You know, I wrote very early on about those changes that it would inevitably lead to a logged in internet. So then I really early on pivoted to, okay, so what can we do to improve that user experience, given that it's going to happen? And one of my biggest worries was that you're going to have to log into every website and they're all going to start sending you emails. So actually this is going to make spam terrible. What else should we be thinking about in terms of consumer experience? Like, what are the other pitfalls that we need to engineer our way out of to make sure that consumers are happy? Any of you?
Well, I think frequency of messaging to a consumer is really important. And right now the cookie is based on a device. And so while I can control frequency in certain device settings, I can't necessarily control frequency of my messaging to you across all your devices. And so we've all had that ad that follows you around at a higher frequency than you'd want. And that just leads us to poor advertising experiences. And I think it's something that users are going to notice, because you almost always notice when something seems awry or something seems to be following you, or something seems to be following you at a frequency that you're not comfortable with, and it actually has a negative impact on the brand messaging. So I think the fact that we could control the experience that end users have to their benefit, not for our benefit, but for their benefit, they'll like their experience on the open web much more.
I think that, yeah, I think that's a great point, Amanda. And by the way, I keep thinking, Andrew, that those shoes were following you around. Did you actually ever buy them, or you just delete the ad? So, you know,
They're already bought.
They're already bought. Oh, the worst kind of spend, isn't it? So, you know, I think frequency, you know, looking at that, I also think sort of the consistency and the structure of the messaging. Right now, you're getting so many different, you know, messages. You know, it's based on government regulation, you know, also on decisions by players like Apple. I was just in a meeting earlier on today. We were talking about the messaging that may come with IDFA. And it's sort of like, how is a publisher, you know, we wanted the best, going back to my earlier point, people are coming to us for a reason. We want to make sure they have the best possible experience. And, you know, as we're sort of messaging these things, as they download our apps, or as they, you know, about cookies, and we have different standards we have to adhere to based on the market and based on the environment. And that's just not a good practice. Like, that's just a bad practice that, you know, I think you have to have certain standards that you have to, that are consistent. We, of course, as a publisher, want to have our ability to tailor an appropriate manner to make sure they understand, like, what when they're on their sites, like, this is coming from the Wall Street Journal or the Post. So, you know, so how can we bring that together? I don't know. There's no easy answers. Everything's already so fragmented, even though we're relatively early into the privacy era.
I think that's one of the many reasons that Facebook made the decision they did with IDFA, which is to say, like, oh, if you're going to make this experience worse for my consumers, we're just going to stop using it. We already have a relationship with our consumer. And I think that's exactly what we're talking about with this project, is giving every publisher in every environment the right to have a first-class relationship with their consumer so they can do it how they want. I think that's critical. And then if you're smart, you do it consistently across the environments so the consumer can start getting used to it. So I guess we're running out of time. There's a lot to talk about in this topic, as always. How do we get this done? So the final question is, how can we come together to make this happen? Why don't we start with Andrew?
Yeah, I love this question because it's so important. But even just to hark back to the GDPR example that I mentioned before, which I do say a lot because it's a really good one. It starts with prioritization. All too often, it is really easy to delay the thing that isn't an issue yet. So in this case, there's a lot of companies with a date in their head of January 2022. That's the apocalypse of the third-party cookie. That's not the date to start. The date to start was years ago, and if you didn't then, today, please, because there's a lot to do. But I think number one, it starts with prioritization. This should be everyone's priority. It doesn't matter who you are, frankly, in any part of this market, it should be your priority. It is absolutely vital. And after that, it's collaboration. What we do not need is 36 rivaling solutions for identity and SSO, creating a massive amount of confusion, even more consumer panic, and more fragmentation. We need fewer or one or two. Like we really need to just align on this one together, because it is going to take a lot to deploy it en masse, because we're literally talking about the web, we're talking about the app ecosystem, we're probably talking about a lot of connected TV, broadcasters as well, and other components. Like we don't need many solutions to this one problem. We need few. And yeah, prioritization, and we don't need the ad tech typical response of overcomplicate a problem by making dozens of clones.
Yeah, Chris.
Oh, go ahead. I was going to say, I think the key to in the collaboration is going back to the point before. It's like getting the right amount of collaboration, and that with Trade Desk, with UID 2.0, we're trying to talk to all key stakeholders right now, get everybody's input, but also move very quickly, right? So like keep it simple, move super fast to get it off the ground. And again, so we can get to something that we can put out there for everybody. It can be open source. Everyone can participate. It's not a product that we're trying to build and generate money off of that in particular. And so like just having everybody work together for the better of the internet, and weigh in and then get going, I think is really key here.
So what I was gonna say is, Chris, how can we get publishers to collaborate and work together?
Well, I mean, I think it's it is part of their involvement, and I said, like, an optimistically, I think we're doing more. I think in these different forums. I think some of the industry. I think one thing that's would be very interesting about this, you talk about accountability and collaboration, is what industry associations step up and actually drive solutions versus what don't. And I think that this is going to be very transparent about who's effective in representing us as publishers, who's effective in representing us as an industry. I think that because too much, I think one of the reasons we are in this state, one of the reasons why things just got to get kicked the can down the road, is that the industry associations, which are supposed to be a forum for us to kind of move ahead, didn't. Like, I don't think a lot of times they didn't do their job, and in terms of pushing a difficult answer, or ask the difficult questions, which sometimes have difficult answers, which are not in the best interest of all the players involved, and some of the parties we've talked about earlier. And so I think that that's something about, like, how does this all play out after this? Who do we see as effective and who's not in terms of the industry associations?
What do you think, Amanda? What's the make or break on the project?
Well, I think part of it is everyone leaning in, and buyers tend not to be participants in major solutions. We're usually the recipients of the solution, and then we decide if we're going to buy it after the fact. And that's not what we need to do in this situation. We need to use our media spend to support those that are trying to solve the problem, support the publishers that are adopting the solutions that allow us to navigate a cookieless world before we're in a cookieless world. And so one thing that I think is important is testing now. and being open to those beta testing opportunities and moving these efforts forward with actual spend, so that, you know, we need scale. That's the key to the solution. So it has to be easy, and it has to, you know, be open source, and it needs to be adaptable by everyone. But ultimately, scale is what will make this work best. And there's no better way to drive scale than with media spend. And so I think if buyers support the efforts of everyone in this conversation, of how much of the efforts of all these companies are going to solving a solution that's outside of themselves, that helps everyone and not just themselves, will be the benefit. So getting in the conversation and spending your money appropriately.
Love it. Well, this has been a great conversation. So over the past decade, I've often said that to people who don't understand our industry, what I do is I try to make the internet suck a little bit less every single day. And I think that's changed. We're now, you know, as I look at what we can build here, we're actually trying to fix the internet. We're trying to make it work well. And to me, that's super exciting. So thanks for joining us, and thanks for being part of the solution.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.